evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here tonight. For those who don't know me, I'm Kelly Hancock. I'm the Director of Educational Programs and Interpretation here at the American Civil War Museum. And very excited about tonight's program. But before I introduce our guest speaker, I do want to take a moment to tell you about some of our upcoming events. First and foremost, coming up on October 15th, we will have our annual Lincoln Prize Lecture event. And if you haven't already registered for this event, I encourage you to do that. This is going to be a very special evening. We will feature Dr. Etta Fields-Black, who is not only the winner of this year's Lincoln Prize, but she is also the winner of a Pulitzer Prize for her book, Combay. And this event, of course, if you've never been to the Lincoln Prize lecture before, it starts with a reception, so we'll have hors d'oeuvres and wine, and then the winner of the prize will give a talk, and followed by that, a conversation, and the conversation, per usual, will be moderated by Dr. Ed Ayers. So mark your calendars for the Lincoln Prize annual lecture, and if you are a member, you get 25% off. So if you're not a member, it's a good time to think about becoming one. If you are a member, I do want to say thank you. Thank you for your support, because this helps us fulfill our mission to explore, inspire, and promote the public's understanding of the Civil War, its causes, course, and consequences. Also on the calendar at the end of the month, we would like to see you come out to our Appomattox location for the annual Fall Festival. This will be on October 25th. There will be music by the Farm Use String Band, historic trades, cannon demonstrations, local vendors and exhibitors, as well as a silent auction, face painting, and pumpkin painting for kids. And there will be delicious food available on site. And then one last announcement. Every month we do a virtual book talk. October's virtual book talk will be held on the 23rd with Lisa Samia. She is known for her poetry, but she has a new book out on Asia Booth Clark, the sister of John Wilkes Booth. So mark your calendars for that virtual event. You can just register through Eventbrite. We'll send you the link. And now for tonight's speaker, I am very pleased to have with us Dr. Aaron Sheehan-Dean. He is the Fred C. Frey Professor of Southern Studies and Chairman of the History Department at Louisiana State University. He teaches courses on 19th century U.S. history, the Civil War and Reconstruction, and Southern history. He is the author of numerous books, including the award-winning The Calculus of Violence, How Americans Fought the Civil War, and his newest book that he is here to talk about tonight, Fighting with the Past, How 17th Century History Shaped the American Civil War. So let's give Dr. Aaron Sheehan-Dean a warm welcome.
Okay, good evening. First, thank you all for being here. It's really fun to be able to come to Richmond again. This is a great facility, and I'm honored to be on the advisory council, but to actually get here in person is a lot of fun because I do live somewhat farther to the south. So let me start by thanking Rob and Kelly for inviting me and for making this possible. This is really the first time I've been able to talk about this book. In fact, it's not available technically until September 30th, so you're getting it sort of before it's off the press. There are, in fact, copies available. This is the first public talk, really, that I've given on it. And it's fun, and it's, it was a fun book to write, and hopefully it will be a fun book to hear about. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour, and then Rob and I are going to talk a little bit. So I will start, and then I'll sort of work through just a quick outline of what I'm going to actually say as we go, and then I will push ahead. My wife is often reminds me that I talk both too loudly, which the mic will help with, and too fast, so I will do my best to slow down And while I have the mic, I should wish my wife a happy birthday. She's in the back corner there. Happy birthday, she got up at 4:30 in the morning to get on the flight, which is not the way you want to start your birthday, so it's important to recognize her attendance here. My topic tonight is memory, not in the way that I think many of you are probably familiar with. You're students of the Civil War, you're probably familiar with many of these books. Some of the people, Gary Janey, for instance, is the head of the advisory council for the American Civil War Museum, and others. David Blight used to be on it. A lot of these folks have given talks here, or you probably know their work. Over the last 20 years, there has been a robust new field in Civil War history focused on memories of the conflict. Overwhelmingly, these are histories of how we today remember the Civil War. That is, they sort of begin in 1865 and then extend, in some cases, into the 1890s and others the 1930s. For some historians, all the way up to today. My focus is on the memories of the Civil War's participants. That is, how did Civil War Americans think about the past? What history did they know? And how did they use that history to navigate their way through the crisis? My argument is that they used history in the ways that we do. They used their memories to structure how they understood the conflict. And this had important outcomes in terms of shaping the outcomes of the war. It also reveals, I think, interesting ways of thinking about how memory itself works and how history as a discipline works. So here's the kind of outline for what we're going to do today. I'm going to talk about Americans' historical thinking, and in particular the English Civil War, and I'll explain why in just a minute. I'll offer a brief kind of warning about the slipperiness of analogies. And the bulk of this is going to be focused on two moments in the war, both of which concern the experience of Ireland. The title is this talk, What the Irish Taught the Americans, is probably a bit of a misnomer in that there are not a lot of living Irishmen that are sort of going to factor into my talk. But the experiences that Ireland had, particularly in the 17th century, weigh on the minds of Civil War Americans. And those experiences, and I'll talk about what they are, shape in particular Northerners' decisions to resist secession with military force, and also shape, importantly, the end of the Civil War. The kind of generous peace that Lincoln offers at Appomattox and at Durham Station, and in the moments at the end of the war, which set up then a sequence of new challenges for Americans to face. And I think those are due in large part to the ways that history shaped how people were thinking about the proper ways to end a civil war. So my emphasis on the past here is perhaps unexpected. Obviously, Americans had memories of a lot of historical events, the American Revolution most prominently, and I'm happy to talk in the Q&A why that isn't the focus. But what I discovered is a lot of attention paid to the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. So these are the 1640s and 50s largely, and I'll walk through a timeline in just a minute, a very abbreviated kind of summary of that conflict. Americans knew this history. It was the Civil War to them, a unmodified Civil War in the way that when we say today, you remember the Civil War, or let's think about the relationship between the Civil War and today's partisan politics, we don't have to say the American Civil War from 1861 to 65. The English conflict of the 1640s and 1650s functioned that way for Civil War Americans. The participants in the war, both Northerners and Southerners, though I'm going to speak today almost exclusively about Northerners in using the Irish examples, they used this history. They knew it. It was not a lived history, but a deeply felt one. The principal protagonists and the kind of symbols are King Charles I and Oliver Cromwell, his parliamentary opponent. These are the people that come to embody, sort of for good and ill, the kind of the tropes and the processes of civil wars in the English-speaking world. And they are pulled into the rhetoric of Civil War Americans, both for good and for ill. That is, we want to be more like Charles, or we want to be less like Charles, or more like Cromwell, or less like Cromwell. They absorb this history through deep reading. So there is no course in English history in the universities in the United States in the 1840s and 50s. If you go to a university, and even in sort of what would have passed for secondary education, exposure to history would have been primarily classical history. So people studied the Greek and the Roman past. but there is a huge amount of publishing and writing on British history and English history, the British Empire, in the 1840s and 1850s, and Americans are devouring this material. It is reviewed in the newspaper, mostly British authors, some American authors that are weighing in as well. But all those British texts are published in the United States, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally. That is a kind of pirate edition that gets sold. They are debated, they are lectured about. So Americans come to know this history very, very well. They are encountering it, as I say, outside of a kind of academic setting. So it's not quite our relationship to an academic history. These are not monographs in the traditional modern sense, but I will argue that they carry real analytical weight. These are not chronicles. These are not lists of names and dates. Webster's third dictionary actually defines history, and he's got a couple of definitions which are somewhat mechanical at the time. This is sort of the 1830s. But then he also says that history is a matter of judging cause and effect, that is, weighing analytically what changes the world. And the histories that emerge in the 1840s and 50s and into the 60s do that, and Americans pick them up, as I say, quite avidly. The examples of where this turns up, and I'm going to speak just very quickly. Oh, sorry, let me give you the kind of 411 of the English Civil Wars. If you are not someone who has spent, years reading in the 19th century histories, which I don't recommend unless you're an insomniac, as a kind of source, they are not the most riveting material. I just go to the shelf upstairs at the kind of lending space there. You'll get more exciting histories. The historians today refer to the English Civil Wars really as the War of Three Nations. England, Ireland, and Scotland are all kind of tangled in controversies. Beginning in 1637 with a Scottish rebellion that's largely religious in nature, the Presbyterians are angry about the imposition of the Book of Common Prayer, and behind it, an Episcopal structure in the Anglican Church that they see as vaguely Catholic and menacing. There is a series of civil wars within England itself, a first civil war ending in about 1646, and another one that ends with the execution of Charles I. He is the only British monarch executed. That happens in 1649. That's the kind of apogee of the internal violence. There is also an Irish rebellion in 1641, and I will spend a fair amount of time talking about that. It functions as a very important example, particularly for Northerners, about the ways to think about the legitimacy of rebellion and revolution. The parliamentarian side, represented by Oliver Cromwell, sometimes also called the Puritans, that's the religious dissenting faction that, like the Presbyterians of Scotland, are also unhappy with the religious order in England. The Archbishop William Laud is a close ally of Charles I, and they see him as a menace. The parliamentarians proved dominant in those civil wars. After the execution of Charles I, Cromwell was made Lord Protector, functionally a king. He exercises sort of despotic powers and manages England's affairs until he dies in 1658. His son takes over but is not capable of really holding this order together, and so then at that point a rump group of former royalists and also parliamentarians come together and bring Charles II out of exile, and he retakes the throne. That process is called the Restoration. This happens in 1660. So it is a very complicated, kind of torturous sequence, which also opens up lots of lines of interpretation. So that for Americans, abolitionists who are interested in the Puritans and valorized Cromwell, there is plenty of evidence there to use. And for the conservatives who maybe bend towards Charles I, there is the reassurance that at the end of this period, order was restored and the crown was restored and sort of normalcy resumed. So it has contradictory elements, which is part of what makes it fertile ground for Americans and their memory. There is, of course, a great deal more to say, though I'm not the one to do it. I'm not a historian of the English 17th century. What I've said exhausts most of what I know about it, in fact. I will sort of delve in more deeply as we move from examples here, but I wouldn't doubt that some of you actually know this better than me. Examples of how this gets to be used appear all over, and I'm going to start very quickly, too. One from Lincoln in February of 1865. There's a group of Confederate commissioners that are theoretically trying to negotiate for peace. There's a famous meeting between Lincoln and some of his advisors and the Confederates. It doesn't go anywhere. That's a last-ditch effort to kind of negotiate a solution. But in the course of the conversation, Robert Hunter raises the issue, the example of Charles I, and he says, you remember that Charles I, in the middle of the First Civil War, dealt very generously with his parliamentary enemies. Lincoln offers this cagey response. I do not profess to be posted in history. On all such matters, I will turn you over to Seward. All I distinctly recollect about the case of Charles I is that he lost his head in the end. So it is both an eerie premonition for someone who will be assassinated by a bullet to the head, maybe 2 months after he says this, and also Lincoln being coy. He actually knows this history very well, as evidenced by the fact that he understands what summoning Charles I means. And also I would point out that when Lincoln was a lawyer in Springfield, Illinois, he and William Herndon shared an office, and they had the 5 volumes of Macaulay's History of England since James II, the first 150 pages of which are about the English Civil Wars. Macaulay is by far the most important of these English authors, writing in the 1840s and 50s, hugely popular all over the English-speaking world, a perpetual touchstone. You don't actually have to say Thomas Babington Macaulay, you just refer to Macaulay, and everyone knows you're talking about Macaulay. Not only does he have Macaulay's text in his library in Springfield, but he checks the book out from the Library of Congress while he's president. Truth be told, he shares a library card with John Nicolay and John Hay as secretaries. Apparently those are harder to come by, library cards in the 19th century. So we can't actually prove that Lincoln got it and read it, but one of them did, and it suggests to me, again, the importance and the ways that they are deeply engaged with history. There's plenty to occupy Lincoln during the Civil War, and the fact, and Nicolay and Hay, the volume of correspondence is staggering, and yet they bothered to take a 5-volume sequence of history books out of the Library of Congress in order to use them, I think, to manage their way through the conflict. It also turns up on the podium at Gettysburg, not from Lincoln, about which we would probably have learned by now, that being not a very long speech, but in the main event for the day at Gettysburg was Edward Everett, Massachusetts conservative, who nonetheless is very strongly pro-Union during the war, and is on the stage with Lincoln. He is, as I say, the main speaker that day. This is, remember, November of 1863, and Everett uses the example of Charles II and that return to England in 1660 and the magnanimity that he shows to the former Puritans and the former parliamentarians who had fought and actually executed his father. There's a handful of executions of the regicides, the people directly responsible for the execution. Maybe 11 men are executed. But there is a general amnesty given by Charles II. And Everett raises this at the Gettysburg speech as a way to signal forward how a civil war should naturally be ended. And that sort of conservative end is important, and I will return to that at the end. So those are sort of 2 quick examples of many that occupy the pages of this book of Civil War Americans quoting and referencing this. And I want to now sort of turn and dig in carefully on these 2 Irish examples. And, one last point of sort of theory, as much theory as I promised to inflict on you, because of course historians are allergic to theory. And this actually comes not from a historian, but from a rhetorician, I.A. Richards, from the 1930s. Let us consider more closely what happens in the mind when we put together 2 things belonging to very different orders of existence. The most important happenings are the mind's efforts to connect them. The mind is a connecting organ, and it can connect any 2 things in an indefinitely large number of ways. What he's describing is the process of drawing analogies. And history at its heart, I would argue, is a process of analogical reasoning. We look to the past and we study the past in order to understand what's happening to us today. Many of us also intrinsically are interested in the past, but the past for its own sake, in the 19th century we would have called antiquarianism, and with the rise of a modern discipline of history, an analytical discipline of history, the goal is learning and advancing knowledge. And doing that sometimes requires bringing together things that are similar but maybe not exactly alike, because no 2 things in history ever are. And what Richards is, I think, cautioning us about is the degree to which our minds can almost play a trick on us by making analogies draw more weight than they perhaps should. And this certainly happens through the Civil War as Americans, both North and South, invest themselves in analogies that eventually carry them beyond their own best wishes. So 2 quick examples of that, and then I will actually talk about the Irish. The first are abolitionists, who, as I said, idolized the Puritans. They valorized Cromwell. They, of course, begin the Civil War as the only bona fide pacifists in the United States. And yet, because of that commitment to Cromwell and to a vigorous military repudiation of their enemy in the Civil War, the abolitionists become the most strident advocates for a hard war against the South. This is a very unlikely position for them to occupy. And I think part of understanding how they go from being pacifists to hard war advocates, that is from hawks, from doves instantly into hawks, is the ways in which the analogies that they draw and the more they dig into and sort of put themselves behind Cromwell, they are sort of wedded to a vision of using military violence. Confederates are no more consistent. Confederates lionize the royalist side, also called the Cavaliers at the time. And there's a whole section of my book that talks about the kind of contrasting genealogies. That is, I take more seriously the language of the Cavalier and the Puritan than, say, William Taylor in his famous book Cavalier and Yankee. The endorsement of Charles I, the sort of the defense of him and the rejection of his execution as regicide, brings Confederates perilously close to endorsing monarchy. And that too, in a position, right, in a society riven by class conflict as the Confederacy was, as the Union was, endorsing monarchy is a very awkward thing to do. So that's the sort of warning and one of the lessons of this, which is the dangers of analogizing. So let me turn now to the sort of main event, which is thinking about the past. That is the question of legitimate rebellion. And I'm framing this first by the thinking that was paramount in the history texts on the legitimacy of resistance to King Charles I. He's a Stuart, so when their colleague here is complaining about the Stuarts, that's who we're talking about here. And Macaulay, I think, gives the sort of standard interpretation as of the mid-19th century. Many English kings had occasionally committed unconstitutional acts, but none had ever systematically attempted to make himself a despot and to reduce the parliament to a nullity. Such was the end which Charles distinctly proposed to himself. They're very unflattering treatments. All of the 17th and 18th century treatments of the English civil wars tend to lionize Charles. They are very critical of Cromwell. After the Restoration in particular, his stock sort of plummets. His corpse is dug up and the bones are sort of scattered, and some of them may be under the floor of a college at Cambridge and so on. But in the mid-19th century, there is a kind of reevaluation. There are revisionist histories who are now arguing that the resistance manifested in the English Civil War was legitimate resistance, that when tyranny impresses itself, then Democrats, lowercase d, though not many Englishmen would have called themselves Democrats, let's say lowercase r Republicans, that they are justified in standing up against it. So how does this translate into the sort of newspaper language of the time? Harper's is key on this. They use the English Civil War as an example throughout. Cromwell and Washington were rebels, but they were rebels against real oppression, for which there was no hope of remedy but in arms. That is, there are legitimate rebellions and there are illegitimate rebellions. It's essential for Northerners to distinguish between these things. The United States, after all, is founded on a revolution. So you can't very well just sort of blackball rebels per se. It requires a more careful analysis. And in this analysis, Hampden of the ship tax controversy at the start of the war, Cromwell, John Pym, and others, the heroes of the parliamentary side, get aligned with Washington and Franklin and Jefferson as the heroes of the American Revolution. Harper's then sort of broadens this out more in more sort of theoretical terms. Rebellions are not necessarily just or unjust, but hitherto, as they have generally been risings of the people against tyranny, they have inspired sympathy in all generous minds. The Great Rebellion in England was the protest of the English people against the despotic, irresponsible prerogative of the crown. That is, let's remind Northerners, there is an example for just rebellion in the 17th century, and Harper's has clearly read their Macaulay, and they know this. The problem in the case of the Confederate or white Southern claims, before they are officially Confederates, is that there is no real oppression. This is the argument that Northerners make over and over again, that what the Confederates or what the proto-Confederates are complaining about in the act of secession is something that hasn't yet actually occurred. There is no true oppression. And in fact, you can see this in the haste with which the fire eaters, those pro-secessionists that urged the South towards secession in the winter after Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration in March of 1861, they have to move quickly. Because if Lincoln is inaugurated and nothing happens to slavery, then all of the kind of rhetoric starts to look pale and thin. And Lincoln, of course, has no plans to move against slavery. He said repeatedly, I don't have the capacity to end slavery in any of the places where it currently exists. And so they are moving quickly in a way that suggests to Northerners that the claims of oppression are unjust. And it is essential for democracies to resist unjust rebellions just as they might be founded on just rebellions. Luckily for the Northerners, they have an example from the 17th century of an unjust rebellion. And this is the Irish Rebellion of 1641. Very quick backstory on this. The English begin their sort of dominance of the island of Ireland in the 12th century. But over the centuries between the 12th and the 16th, the English immigrants there largely assimilate into Irish culture. They speak Irish. Many of them convert to Catholicism. They intermarry with Irish families. Those are people usually predominated as the Old English. Beginning in the Stuart administration in the late 16th century and the early 17th century, more absolutist, kind of Protestant certain immigrants are coming from England, and they are imposing more draconian rules on the Irish. They're led by another ally of Charles I, a man named Thomas Wentworth, who's the Lord Deputy of Ireland until he's called back by Parliament into England. And so there is a shift in the kind of pressure that England is applying to Ireland, new in the very late 1500s and the early 1600s, which yields this rebellion in 1641. They are also watching the Scots, and the fact that there is this Scottish rebellion in 1637 suggests to the Irish now might be a good time with a distracted England to seize the opportunity to expel the new English in particular, who have been so predatory in terms of seizing land and restricting the opportunities of Catholics. This is a bloody and awful rebellion. I'm not going to defend the conduct of either side. It's analogous in most respects to the 30 Years' War happening on the European continent in terms of the level of bloodshed. And there are atrocities committed by both sides. The story that the English tell themselves is that those atrocities were only committed by the Irish. So this is the most famous chronicle of them. So John Temple was an administrator in the castle at Dublin, who gathered depositions and affidavits from Protestant residents of Ireland, accusing the Catholics of savagery and butchery, murder and rape, infanticide, sort of every horror that you can imagine. Temple accumulates those. The text is lavishly illustrated with these kinds of woodcuts. Temple's, I'm reluctant to call it reporting. Historians of this conflict today recognize it as a valuable but very problematic source of evidence. Nonetheless, has tremendous reach. Temple's figures and the story that he tells about Irish perfidy lasts well into the 19th century. That is, the histories of the 19th century promulgate a very Temple-forward interpretation. The first attempt to capture Dublin, this scheme was betrayed, and 30,000 men, now rendered desperate by failure, committed a savage massacre which spread all over the country and ended in the slaughter of more than 40,000 Protestants. So a conflict framed exclusively in religious terms and explained really through the idiom of savagery, that the Irish, as the English have long known, are subhuman, that they are not fighting a civilized war. There's no politics in this. There's no military agenda. There is simply the kind of unnatural savagery unleashed on unsuspecting Protestants. And that language, as I say, is embedded deeply in the 19th century histories, and Americans absorb it as well. This is a quote from a modern historian talking about the ways in which that rhetoric and that evidence shaped the British response. Accounts of rebel violence justify the use of excessive force by English and Scottish armies in Ireland in 1642, and again in 1649 when Cromwell famously goes, and I'll talk about that in a moment. I would add that it also helps stiffen the spine of the North in the American Civil War. That is, as Northerners are looking at this example, what they see is an example of unjust rebellion and of the necessity of suppressing it. for a democracy to survive and flourish, it isn't sufficient to tolerate insurrection, Lincoln's initial classification of what's happening in the act of secession. In his militia call in 1861, he refers to what's happening as an insurrection. But over the course of the conflict, the language of rebellion is used most often, and of course, as many of you probably know, the official records that we draw on today to write histories of the Civil War are the official records of the War of the Rebellion. This isn't the first rebellion that Americans have had to put down. You can think of the various efforts in the immediate post-revolutionary era: Shays' Rebellion, Dorr's Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton and Madison both helping suppress those, helping establish the supremacy of the nation in the face of this illegitimate rebellion. The result, as I say, is stiffening the spine, or in other words, committing to a hard and bloody war. Orestes Brownson is a Northern Catholic conservative who nonetheless endorses a quite strident view of what will happen in this war. Confederates gave up their rights, their faith, their honor when they became rebels, betrayed their country and took up arms to subvert its government. And they have no right to complain if compelled to drink, and to drink even to the dregs the bitter cup of humiliation. Right? This is the kind of justification that powers the North to vigorously resist secession, to mount a war that lasts for 4 years and that kills 350,000, probably many more than that, Northerners in its course. And this is still a question that I think we are struggling to kind of properly calibrate, that is to account for the depth of Northern resistance to secession and the sacrifices that Northerners make. More Northerners are killed in the course of the war than Southerners. And so accounting for why they do that seems to me important, and a big part of it is that it comes out of this deep sense of differentiating good rebellions from illegitimate rebellions. Let me now turn quickly, because I see that my time is running short. I'm trying to talk more slowly. I'm not sure if that's why my time is running short. And think about how wars end. This is a famous image that many of you have no doubt seen, based on a drawing by Alfred Woad of Lee exiting the Wilmer McLean house at Appomattox. The only real sign of defeat here is, I think, the bent neck of the horse, something like a pose of supplication. Lee, of course, ramrod straight, so if you didn't know, you wouldn't understand that he had just surrendered his army and given up. And so the question here is how to end the Civil War. What is the right way to calibrate a close to this conflict? Radicals in the North and many mainstream Republicans want to ensure that the end, whatever end comes, will not then turn into another conflict 20 years down the road. And the way to ensure that is to incapacitate the leadership of the South, and the way to do that is to seize land. That is to seize and redistribute property to reduce the social and political power that the slaveholding elite who led the South into secession possess. And the model for this is Ireland and the dispossession of Ireland. Sedgwick here, a Republican from New York. I hope to see the estates of rebels distributed under our homestead law to immigrants, to see them divided in bounties to our soldiers. These are some of the bitter but wholesome and necessary fruits of this rebellion. And Sedgwick here is drawing explicitly on the example of what happens after the Irish Rebellion. Cromwell really doesn't return to Ireland with armies until 1649. Ireland goes through a complicated sequence that I won't go on, but they are still an active rebellion, and in 1649, Cromwell returns there. The model for this, as I say, comes from Cromwell. Wendell Phillips, a Northern abolitionist, probably the most reliant on the metaphor, the analogy of the English Civil Wars. Phillips talks and lectures constantly. He's a peer of Garrison. He is perpetually raising Cromwell as a virtuous example. He says as well, at one point, I was kind of astonished to find this, we must follow Cromwell even unto Ireland. So when he writes, we must take up the South and organize it anew to absorb 6 millions of ignorant, embittered, bedeviled Southerners and transmute them into honest, decent, educated Christian mechanics, worthy to be brothers of New England Yankees, he is thinking explicitly about the effort to remake Ireland in the wake of Cromwell's final suppression of the rebellion, which involves most famously the dispossession of Catholics. So Catholic landholders are driven into the west of Ireland. The phrase at the time was to hell or Connaught. Connaught being there are 4 provinces of Ireland. The western province of Ireland is Connaught. Irish priests murdered or driven into exile there, and wealthy Irish landholders dispossessed of their property and pushed into the howling wastes to the west, right? We're looking at Ireland. England is to the east across the Irish Sea there. Dublin Castle, of course, facing Liverpool. 2 sites in grey there of Cromwell's terrible massacres, the one in the middle of the country at Drogheda, which is still a synonym today for bloody and unjustified massacre, and then down in the south at Wexford, where Cromwell's troops commit another series of atrocities. And Cromwell was quite earnest about replicating England to the extent possible in Ireland, that the way to fix Ireland is to import virtuous Protestant Englishmen, have them sort of repopulate the island, and finally that will make it a productive space. And as I say, for abolitionists and for some Republicans as well, this is explicitly the model that they are endorsing. Charles Sumner, famous abolitionist senator from Massachusetts, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, uses this example as well throughout. In this case, he is talking about the efforts to appoint military governors in the South. There is nothing new under the sun in the military governors we are beginning to find a prototype in the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell. So think Andrew Johnson as military governor of Tennessee. It is an arbitrary government, murmur yet many. Yes, arbitrary but beneficial. These are powers unknown to the English Constitution, I believe, but they are very necessary for the Puritan nation at this time, he's quoting. Perhaps no better words could be found in explanation of the Cromwellian policy adopted by our president. Now, Sumner is an advocate for Cromwell. Lincoln was not, I assure you, eager to be called Cromwellian. That was an adjective that he would have disdained. He is not a celebrant of Charles I. Lincoln, about whom I'm not talking much, I'll talk a little bit more about Lincoln, but he walks a kind of moderate line, like the Harpers sort of disliking the tyranny of the Stuarts, but not endorsing the excesses. But Sumner has none of that caution here. And for him, that model of military governors adjudicating Ireland as captured province is perfect. This is, in fact, what happens eventually in Reconstruction. He's anticipating the Reconstruction districts under the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 that break up southern states. The boundaries disappear only temporarily, but they are managed by military governors, in every case a former Union general, just as Cromwell appointed his lieutenants to manage the distribution of those regions. For conservatives, this is exactly the policy not to follow. Lazarus Powell, a Democrat still in the US Congress, how was it with Oliver Cromwell? The Protector appointed 12 major generals to take charge of the 12 districts into which he divided the British Empire, and they went forth armed with all power. They decimated the people, they taxed them at their discretion and exacted enormous tribute from them, and in that way the people were held in subservience to the military authority. So you can see in this language a continuation of the complaints that conservatives and Democrats in the North have been making about Lincoln's impositions on civil liberties, about the extent to which Lincoln is embracing a kind of Cromwellian despotism. Northern Democrats repeatedly refer to him that way as Cromwell because of this blurred line between a kind of political and military figure. And for just as much as Sumner is endorsing the example of those governors, Powell is rejecting it. And he has good company. Samuel Cox, perhaps Sumner's equal in terms of depth of historical knowledge, but a Democrat and a conservative. If I should wish to present a case where all the horrors of subjugation, penury, devastation, and confiscation have been felt, I would go to Ireland, crushed by the cruelty of a system similar to that now and here sought to be inaugurated, that is Sumner's policy. Ireland points a skeleton figure continually in all her sad history, her warning to our rulers. So where Sumner is saying this is a policy to endorse, Cox is saying this is a policy that will fail, that is cruel and vindictive. It's a vindictive peace, not a just peace. And you have only to look at Ireland today in the 1860s to see its failure. In 1867, there will, of course, be a Fenian uprising in the western side of Ireland. Much of it south of Connaught, that's in sort of Cork and those regions in the southwest. There was a Fenian uprising in the earlier period. his argument, and Cox knew this story, he both knew the history extraordinarily well. He and Sumner, from my view, should each get an honorary doctorate, given the kind of complexity and the density of the historical allusions and the footnoting in their Senate speeches. It's sort of a wonder to me that they do any Senate business, because I don't know how they find time to research the speeches they give. Cox had traveled in England and Ireland in the antebellum era, had released a travel log sort of explaining his observations. And one of the things that he says even before the war is the restive nature of Ireland and the degree to which the persistent subjugation stemming from that Cromwellian conflict and the land confiscation of the 17th century could still be felt in the politics. This is a theme endorsed by other Northern conservatives. The Princeton Review, a journal in the North, at war's end, writes, all unnecessary punishments are positive evils. They exasperate instead of subduing. They exalt criminals into martyrs. The sympathy felt for the victim is transferred to the cause for which they suffer. Unnecessary punishment degrades justice into vengeance. All history proves its impolity. Ireland, Poland, and Venetia stand as examples and warnings. Ireland, subjugated since Cromwell, Poland divided between Germany and Russia at the time, and Venetia dominated by the French Empire. So again, these are the conservative arguments for a generous and charitable peace at the end of the war. And I would argue that at Appomattox and at Durham Station, notwithstanding Sherman's sort of failure in his first round, the terms given to former Confederates reflect the conservative wish that this not be a vengeful peace, that this is already a kind of reconciliationist peace. Lincoln is relying on Macaulay. I don't know that he's necessarily following Cox's advice. At one point, Cox says to Lincoln, what we need is a policy antithetical to that pursued by Cromwell. We want something generous and robust like Charles II. Cox, among others, like Edward Everett, used Charles II as an example that Lincoln should emulate here. And I don't think Lincoln is necessarily hoping to restore a monarchy, right? He doesn't see the wheel turning that far. But Lincoln, who began the war fighting for reunion, understands that to bring peace, a cessation of military conflict, he can focus on loyalty and national adherence. Doing so, though, let's recognize, means ignoring emancipation and the social and political changes that are necessary to bring emancipation into a more meaningful form. And this is one of course, the great tragedies of the end of the Civil War, which is that the peace that was reached did not extend to generating a viable social and economic climate or political climate for the free people, for African Americans to experience something like equality in the post-war world. And the result, of course, is that it requires a second Reconstruction 100 years later to begin doing that. In this context, relying on the analogy to the English Civil War and on the advice of Macaulay leads Lincoln to favor established powers. It reflects, I think, the conservative sort of undertow of history to pull us back towards established power, towards the status quo. Radicals like Wendell Phillips and Sumner wanted a history that challenged the status quo. They saw the end of the Commonwealth, that is what England was called under Cromwell, in 1660, and they wished that somehow it had been carried forward as a true republic, that it had not gone there. So they kind of stopped the story. Let me conclude by noting just that the conflicts among Civil War Americans remind us that history is, and has always been, an interpretive discipline. It requires us assessing, using analogical thinking. I'm not here to say stop thinking metaphorically or stop drawing comparative history. I actually think comparative history is an important way to pursue questions, particularly around the Civil War. But the importance of recognizing context and of being careful of the ways in which, in analogizing, we don't wind up drawing ourselves into surprising and perhaps regrettable positions. Thank you.
This topic?
I did not start as an expert on the English Civil Wars, I assure you. I had a previous book called Reckoning with Rebellion, which sort of situated the American Civil War in the relationship to other civil and national conflicts in the mid-19th century, things like the Taiping Rebellion and the Polish Uprising of 1863. I was reading a lot of newspapers and looking at rhetoric, and I kept seeing these references to Cromwell, and I thought, that's odd. I know the Elvis Costello song Oliver's Army. I don't know a lot about Oliver Cromwell, but I'm curious because Confederates are calling Lincoln Cromwell. The New York Herald, the most prominent Democratic paper and the most widely read paper in the United States, is calling him Cromwell. And I sort of started to pull that thread. And in doing it, I realized that in fact, the analogy is useful throughout the whole conflict. It's not just Lincoln, it's Cromwell. Abolitionists use it, conservatives use it, moderates use it. And so it was really, I would say, driven by the sources and by sort of plumbing newspapers and then the personal papers of various figures and finding the depth to which they relied on history. And then it sort of became obvious to me. We've had all this talk about memory and history, but rarely, I think, do we take seriously Civil War Americans as historical thinkers. And I think there's a lot more to be said on this. Obviously, there's classical antecedents that Americans are drawing on, lots of references to Thucydides and other figures from classical history in the newspapers. So, you know, if graduate students are listening, there are other books to be written on this topic, but this was the one I did.
We owe it all to Elvis Costello, apparently. So you spent a lot of time thinking about Northerners and analogies, historical analogies. What historical analogies did the Confederates embrace and employ?
So there is a strong endorsement of the royalist side. And as I say, this edges close to a celebration of monarchy. Their telling is that they are respecting hierarchy and order and the rule of law, that the unseating of Charles I, the rump parliament as it's called that replaces him, the bare bones that follows that, the Pride's Purge. One of Cromwell's lieutenants rides a horse into Parliament and expels the members who won't pledge fealty to him. And so from their perspective, this is Cromwell and the Puritans generally represent the sort of excesses of liberty. And of course it gets us into very problematic territory for a whole bunch of reasons. There are interesting articles in DeBow's review, The Southern Messenger in the 1850s, parsing Southerners and Northerners as Cavaliers and Puritans. And people like George Fitzhugh come very close to saying liberty itself is a terrible thing. They certainly spent a lot of time sort of beating up Puritans. Jefferson Davis, for instance, in a famous speech to the Mississippi Senate in 1862, describes Northerners. He says, our opponents are the people dragged from the bogs and fens of Ireland and Scotland by Cromwell. Kind of unwashed hordes of Ireland and Scotland. And they settled the north. We were settled by the elegant Normans. And if you want a lot of fun, trace the kind of genealogies of what the noble Roman-nosed Norman descendant looks like 10 centuries later. They actually do a physiognomy. There are cutouts of the kind of squat, what does they say, robin-breasted, paunch-bellied Anglo-Saxon. This is before the Anglo-Saxons are a kind of fixation. You distinguish those quite carefully, and the Confederates say, we're descendants of the Normans, they were royalty. The North were descendants of the kind of the rabble. And it's, from my mind, precisely the wrong way to use this language, because of course he's dealing with, as Sumner and others say, the Americans were all mixed. There were Cavaliers in the North, there were Cavaliers in the South, and we've all come out of the bogs and fens of Ireland. As, we were not the first sons. It's the second and third sons that sort of come to America that take the risk on that in the 17th century. But they do endorse, so there's a lot of kind of who we are by who we're not. We are not the Puritans. Louis Wigfall, the Texas senator, says this sort of continuously. He's got a great line about the Puritans. They sold us our slaves for the love of gold, and now they're stealing our slaves for the love of God. Wigfall is sort of just clever enough to get himself into trouble. But he's one of these people who's rhetorically very adept at using this as a counterexample. There's actually a biography of Cromwell that goes on for sale here in Richmond in one of the bookstores at sort of Christmas time, 1863. And the Daily Examiner is just sort of fit to be tied. What's next? How about a biography of John Brown next to Oliver Cromwell? And Abraham Lincoln, we can complete the trinity of sort of horrible devils that you can scare your children with. Like, they don't know why this biography is even being sold in the store. And their connection to Brown is fascinating, because Brown himself idolized Cromwell. Joel Hedley wrote a famous biography of Cromwell, an American writer in the 1840s, and John Brown had that sort of with him at all times. That old Puritan, as they called him. So for Brown, Cromwell was likewise a model to emulate.
Wow, how very interesting. You began with a reference to Lincoln and suggested that Lincoln referred discussions of history to Seward, but then later said that in his office in Springfield, he had a history of 4 volumes of English history. How did he understand history and employ history to the extent that that can be discerned?
Yeah, he doesn't speak very explicitly about it. He doesn't make these references, certainly not the way that Davis did in that very obvious sort of way, nor is he like Sumner or Phillips sort of constantly using this. But it is clear that Lincoln is thinking about America in a trajectory that begins in the English Civil Wars of the 17th century, moves through the Glorious Revolution, which is when the kind of constitutional protections that are sort of previewed in the English Commonwealth are fastened down, right? This is the defeat of James II, William of Orange is brought over, and a kind of constitutional order is finally created, albeit not with a written constitution, but a constitutional order in England. That there is a kind of movement from the English Civil Wars through the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, and then the American Civil War. That's a kind of continuous trajectory, and I put Lincoln in this Whiggish trajectory.
Right.
That is, the Whigs are the kind of dissenting party in the 18th century, in 18th century English politics, but there is also a Whiggish kind of philosophical orientation, one that sees humanity in a kind of inevitable trajectory towards greater liberalism and freedom and opportunity, and Lincoln certainly believes that the United States is now in the vanguard of that. And so, we might be disappointed, as I said at the end, in Lincoln's decision to sort of sanction a peace that was not robust and progressive in the ways that in the 21st century we can see were necessary. But he saw the preservation of a democratic republic as a result of repudiating secession and of ending slavery as a tremendous accomplishment that sort of fit the last jewel in the crown of the growth of natural liberty in the English-speaking world. But that trajectory, and there are a series of editorials at the end of the war that make this argument. I didn't think this up. This is laid out in a variety of places, that sequence began with the English and it ends with the Americans. There are actually British thinkers, Goldwin Smith, professor at Oxford and a strong endorser of the Union, who makes this argument. He says, in England, we have kind of lost the energy for reform, right? The Second Reform Act doesn't pass until after the Civil War ends, and it is America that now picks up the mantle, that is extending the tradition of Whiggish liberty. And I think Lincoln is very clearly in that spot, a spot where you would resist the tyranny of the Stuarts, you would not give yourself over to the despotism that Cromwell inhabits, that you sort of thread a moderate's line. And this is why I think ultimately we finish the Civil War with a kind of moderate's victory. It is clearly not a radical's victory. The abolitionists do not get the end of the war that they are hoping for. Clearly the Confederates do not get a kind of return to the past that they were hoping for. And even Northern conservatives, I would argue, are more dissatisfied. They've been complaining perpetually about infringements on civil liberties. And it's difficult for Lincoln to kind of reassure people in this way. But I see sort of the circumstantial evidence that he is reading Macaulay and these other histories and trying to kind of take from that the most measured parts of that history.
Very interesting. As you rightly say, 19th century is the last part is the beginning of academic history as we understand it, and history, as you say, also is not, English history is not well taught in the United States, and what history is taught is sort of classical studies. How well known is a man like Cromwell to the average American at the Civil War period?
Yeah, I was really surprised by how well known. I mean, you just say Cromwell. You don't say Oliver Cromwell, the one-time Lord Protector of England. Cromwell is, in the newspapers, they never modify. Also Milton, right? Milton is another key figure here. That is John Milton of Paradise Lost. Americans revered Milton, and Paradise Lost in particular. That may not be a text that's sort of at our fingertips these days. Milton wrote Paradise Lost. He was also basically the kind of chief diplomatic officer for Cromwell's regime. He is the interpreter, the secretary of tongues. So all of the foreign correspondence that comes in, because Milton spoke and wrote every language, he translated that and wrote responses. And in fact, there's an argument that he writes Paradise Lost as a way not to apologize for his participation, but to recognize the excesses that Cromwell attains. Nonetheless, Milton's role here, and American, certainly Southerners' appreciation of Milton is quite sullied. They like him as a poet, and they actually say this during the war. His poetry remains sublime, his political behavior atrocious. Even though I would argue that it's Milton that actually provides the best argument for secession. He writes a treatise called On the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates that's published coincidentally months before the execution of Charles I, in which he makes a stridently democratic case that in a democratic populace, and he thought that England was by this point a kind of democratic community, voters should be allowed to remove their leaders regardless, even if they hadn't committed any infractions. That is, even though Lincoln had not actively oppressed the South still had a right to remove itself. There's exactly one abolitionist journal that so likes Milton that they say, he's right, we should let the South go. But Milton is sort of radioactive for Confederates because of his association with Cromwell, so they can't touch him. But I'm amazed at the references to Milton in the kind of casual sequence. And, in, what was the town? I want to say Dubuque, some Iowa town. There's a lecture on Cromwell, in the evening, and the newspaper editorial just says, come to the library for a lecture on Cromwell. And again, they don't sort of contextualize it or explain, there's no blurb. It's sufficient to say, come here, a lecture on Cromwell, and everybody in Dubuque's going to go down because they want to hear the details. So I was impressed with the degree of penetration that these stories have. Right. Do people know the details of the Civil War? No, but they know these big actors, and they know the kind of ideological symbols that they function as. That Charles is a royalist and conservative and hierarchy, and Milton and Cromwell and Hampton and Sidney, these are men of vigor who resisted that and brought something like a constitutional order to England. And that's sufficient. So it's a shorthand. It is not our kind of rigorous footnoted history. But I found a surprisingly deep knowledge of these and a kind of flexible application.
Fascinating stuff. We'll turn it over to the audience. Gentleman here.
How much of Macaulay had made it to Greenville, Tennessee? President Johnson who comes in, where was he on this? What was his background?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. And I did not spend a lot of time with Johnson, mostly because he's so awful to spend time with, I'll be honest. Right, he's just kind of an unpleasant person. His military governorship looks sort of Cromwellian. And during the war, of course, this is before Cromwell undergoes his brainwashing or whatever happens to change him to be a sort of defender of the planters after the war. During the war, he's talking about hanging people, about filing treason charges against leading Confederates. And so there, I would think there probably was deep penetration. There's been great writing on Macaulay. I lean on a lot of secondary literature. And there's one that talks about, the pirate sails of Macaulay here, that if you go to the Australian outback, you'll find two things in every British immigrant's shack: a copy of the Bible, the King James Bible, and a copy of Macaulay. They somehow have the money to do that. And it's probably not all 5 volumes, and that was maybe, marketing propaganda. But I think Johnson in particular would have seen himself in the kind of righteous vanguard of this, that this is an illegitimate rebellion. Parson Brownlow is another one that I should have written, another Tennessean, who I think would have been sort of sympathetic to the need for sort of root and branch men. This is a language, that root and branch men is language that comes out of the English Civil Wars and out of sort of pulling your enemy out entirely. Even someone as moderate as William Tecumseh Sherman talks repeatedly about resettling the South. What we need, Sherman says, is to send several million northern hardworking Yankees into the South to reshape the culture of this place in the same way that English settlers are being sent to Ireland to remake it. Sherman doesn't make that explicit parallel, but he is, I think, familiar with that history, and his zeal for repopulating the South sort of bears on that example.
Angela.
How much does that like quotation of the, like that argument using those historical examples continue into Reconstruction, like not even saying this is what we should do, but I guess still using those arguments of this is why what we're doing is wrong or why what we're doing is right.
Yes, that is an excellent question that I will pursue in my next book. I'll be honest, I'm one of those terrible Civil War historians who sort of gets to Appomattox and falls exhausted. And so I didn't look in detail at Reconstruction. And now that you raise that, I wish that I had, because I have to, particularly the imposition, I gave you that map of the Reconstruction districts, that at that point the parallels would have been sort of obvious to many people, because the antecedent for military governorships in the English-speaking world is Cromwell's use of them there. I do certainly in the North, that language, the Northern press had made it quite difficult. Certainly the Democratic press had, I think, made even mainstream Republicans kind of gun shy about being accused of being Cromwellian. The Herald has the largest circulation. It's run by James Bennett, who's a Scotsman who had come to the United States. It's a pro-war paper, but it is a profoundly democratic paper. And they're probably the most prominent paper using this. And for them, it's always an example to kind of keep Lincoln and his administration in check. They never endorse any of the kind of abolitionist position of this is an example to emulate. It is always a way that they feel like just raising it should sort of make Lincoln pull back here. And so my sense is that probably a lot of even mainstream Republicans would have been slightly scared off of endorsing that model explicitly, whereas the abolitionists, as I say, sort of lean fully into it. And I honestly sort of got to Wendell Phillips. I thought, well, surely they wouldn't endorse, once I had sort of studied this and realized what Cromwell did in Ireland, well, surely they wouldn't sanction that. And then I find Wendell Phillips saying we should follow him even unto Ireland. But that was actually that in order to fix this problem, you have to pull it out by the root.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, Paul Severance from National Defense University. Talking about doing comparative analysis. And what I found in, my career is that most people tend to focus on what's the same here and make decisions. And what I've discovered is it's probably most important to focus on what's different. And that most people don't take the time to say, here's one situation, here's the current situation, I see what's similar, but what's different? And that in the differences lie the solutions.
Yeah, the context is absolutely key. And that you have to attend to that context very carefully. And I'm not suggesting that comparative thinking isn't useful. And obviously for wars and for military history, it's essential. At the end of the book, I try to talk about this a little bit in the sense that the language that we tend to use is we always fight the last war. This is a kind of old saw in military history and I think popular thinking generally. And my argument would be that we actually don't only fight the last war, we fight all the previous wars. That the sort of the tip of the iceberg above the water is the previous war. Right? So if I say quagmire, everyone goes, Vietnam. Military advisor, Vietnam. And maybe endless war will be the kind of phraseology out of the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq. But beyond that, there are all these preceding wars that sort of are the part of the iceberg under the water line. And so, when military commanders or policymakers are thinking, my concern is you need to get the radar on and not just be sort of looking out off the bow at the tip of the iceberg, but actually understand what are the contours here, what are the similarities, and importantly, what are the differences? Because, and this is part of what historians get sharp. Political scientists don't like us because we always attend to the particularities. They want generalizations and theories that apply. And historians, and I think this is why there's more military historians than there are military political scientists, these cases tend to be unique. And you have to be very careful about just replicating what worked in a past situation in a current one.
Yes, sir.
Did you look at all or find any evidence of sort of I don't want to say the everyman, the everywoman, but certainly there were no shortage of first generation Irish, Scottish, pick a islander immigrants that not only immigrated during the war, immediately before the war, but fought on both sides. Did you get a sense of if they knew their history as well as the average American, what their thoughts were? They
did, and of course it depends on which region those people have emigrated to. So there are a handful of Southern Irish that used this example early in the war to say, we have experienced this We need to resist it. It's going to lead to the kind of tyranny that will dispossess you. There's a Charlestonian and another, maybe there's two South Carolinians that both write sort of long letters about this to newspapers, signing themselves an Irishman or an Erichman, who are saying, we know tyranny when we see it, and what Lincoln is proposing here is tyranny of the kind that we were subject to, our ancestors were subject to. John Mitchell, the Irish nationalist who gets exiled from Ireland to Tasmania, manages to make his way to the United States in the 1850s. He's actually one of the assistant editors on a Richmond newspaper here. Mitchell also makes recourse to this. Mitchell is a strident pro-slavery voice. It's very awkward for Irish reformers of the 19th century because they're generally profoundly anti-slavery and they have a very ambivalent relationship with American abolitionists. American abolitionists often came out of the nativist movement, and I would argue we have sort of misevaluated the degree to which that nativism lasts within the abolition movement. I just think in general we've had too many celebratory histories of abolitionists there, I'll say it on film. And I'm not just trying to be quarrelsome, but I think that it's easy for us to associate ourselves with abolitionists. They, of course, look much better than almost anybody else from the perspective of 2025. They're hardly unsullied, and I think Wendell Phillips in particular, I mean, Phillips gets some credit for helping welcome the Irish to Boston. He makes some efforts. But the things that he writes privately about their smell and their sort of horrible ways reveal that he is not very far from that nativism. So it put Irish reformers in an ambivalent posture because they were pro-union and they wanted to be aligned with Lincoln. But they also, if there was hostility, it generally came from the kind of one-time nativists, current abolitionists, who don't really trust papism, which looks a lot like what the royals of old did. And, you know, the lines get quite complicated here. But it does put modern Irish, some of them, in a difficult spot. There are also Northern Irish immigrants that talk about this as the kind of 19th century version of resisting Cromwell, that sort of flipped the tables again on it. And of course, many that are planning to return to try to liberate Ireland from England from what they've learned in Northern armies.
Alexander.
Similar question, and thank you for your talk. It's
Yeah.
fantastic. But so the Scots-Irish must have been very confused. You know, they were, their ancestors were induced to, settle in Northern Ireland to bolster, as you talked about, to bolster Protestant regime, and then they, migrate to the Southern Appalachians, and then suddenly they're being asked to, fight against the tyrants in the north. And how do you get into that in the book? Scots-Irish.
Yeah, I don't deal probably sufficiently with the Scots-Irish, and I tried to follow a kind of, because there was a little bit of sort of Covenanter language that turns up, right? This is the Kirk, the Scottish church, the Presbyterian church, and the Covenanters are a sort of contingent of sort of resistance in this war that is in the 17th century. And there are some people that explicitly call that out. But as you know, like the lines get quite confused, particularly for those Scots-Irish who would have immigrated into the valley of Virginia and would wind up on the Confederate side of this. And who I think actively resent, of course, Jefferson Davis's statement that, the bogs and fens are where you get the sort of scum of this region. And of course, Northerners were eager to turn that language around and say, it's in those very fens and bogs that democracy and liberty is born. That it's the kind of hardy Scots-Irish, the people that are self-sufficient that come here. There's some very clever kind of repurposing and transfer of that language to claim that the seeds of liberty didn't come from some kind of Anglo-Norman aristocracy, but came out of the kind of hardy stock. And it was also fascinating to me the ways that Anglo-Saxon descent and Norman descent were kept quite distinct. By the end of the 19th century, the kind of racial thinking blurs those and sees Anglo-Saxons as the model. Think of Errol Flynn movies during World War II and the sort of endorsement of this kind of vigorous Anglo-Saxon stock. That was not how Southerners represented that in the 1850s and certainly not in the 1860s, when the Anglo-Saxons were the kind of rudimentary tribesmen of England who had only been elevated by the Normans. Terrifically ironic, because the 19th century is the heyday in England of the Norman yoke, the idea that the Normans came in as part of this French conquest and had subjugated the English and were precisely the part of England they wanted to hold at bay. And so this leaves many conservative Englishmen sort of confused about what's going on here. Why are you celebrating the Normans? The Normans are the sort of historical enemy. It took me a long time to untangle this, and maybe I haven't fully done it, but it was sort of fascinating to trace these contrary lines. And again, this is where I'm reminded of history as an interpretive discipline. That we're not the first ones to be selective in our reading of the past. We're not the first. We get accused of, everyone gets accused of using history politically. The writing of history is political, and it was in the 17th century and the 19th century, and it remains so today.
One final question, Mr. King.
Can you talk at all about how belief in white supremacy influenced people on all sides of the groups that you've described? Because it seems to me that belief was quite prominent in every group that you've described who were otherwise in conflict.
It is, to be sure, and it's certainly part of what makes it easy for Lincoln to see the settlement of the Civil War as two white men shaking hands at Appomattox, and to not need. Now Lincoln starts, right, in his last speech, he says, we should think about the enfranchisement of black men, perhaps soldiers and the very intelligent, he says. This is the speech in which John Wilkes Booth is in the audience, and he says, now I will kill him. Like, now he's gone too far. Lincoln is a man of his time, and in that sense, believes in the superiority of the white man over the black. And so he is eager to end slavery. He feels slavery is profoundly wrong, but neither does he imagine that black men will somehow outcompete white men, or that they need to be given necessarily special protection. Though, again, Lincoln may have evolved. I think Eric Foner has charted quite well the changes in Lincoln's sort of racial thinking. Part of what emerged importantly for me was the way in studying this was the way in which the absence of race as an analytical factor, or really a force at all in the English Civil War, is important in the 19th century because it allows Confederates to obscure the extent to which race is driving the creation of the Confederacy. They can talk about Charles I and tyranny and the necessity of standing up to tyranny and the protection of hierarchy against regicide, and never once mention slavery. And several of these say, several Confederate editorials, even Wigfall, for instance, Louis Wigfall says, this is a replay of the conflict. Slavery may be the animating force in this particular moment, but slavery is not actually the underlying principle. The underlying principle is the resistance to tyranny. That is, rhetorically, the English Civil War is an effective way for Confederates to try to keep slavery sort of out of the public discourse. And its absence in the North, that is, it is not a factor, and so it leads Northerners to talk solely in these very abstract constitutional terms. To talk about the end of a war as generous without needing to think about the social and political changes that have to be put in place to make emancipation meaningful. So with Confederates, I think it willfully obscures slavery, and with Northerners, in a way, it sort of unintentionally blinds them to the fact that there is a central element that was not present in the English Civil War, just talk of contextual differences, that is present in 19th century America. Religion was paramount in the 17th century. It plays very little role in the 19th century, but race plays a central one. And so here, the analogy kind of breaks down and it's insufficient. And that's where I think it, in a way, sort of blinds Lincoln and others to thinking through the full ramifications of the policies they endorse.
Excellent. Professor Aaron Sheehan-Dean, thank you so much. That was tremendous.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I say this at the end of every talk. Thank you for coming, of course. If you're a member of the museum, thank you for your support. If you are not yet a member of the museum, please consider joining. Our ability to bring great speakers to Richmond is contingent on that support to a very large extent, so please consider that. Don't forget, 15th of October, Dr. Etta Fields Black, Lincoln Prize winner, Pulitzer Prize winner, will be here talking about her book on the Combahee River Raid and Harriet Tubman. It'll be a great occasion. Please join us for that. Thank you for coming. We have a book signing, so if you'd like to buy a copy, please join us outside in the lobby. Thank you.